Hello everyone and welcome to today's Changemaker Summit. Today I'm really excited by the people we have here presenting and joining us. Today's session is called Arts, Activism and Power, a People Power, a Toolkit for Freedom. And we're joined by arts-based activists from kind of all over the planet, which is amazing. So I'm going to ask each one of them to introduce themselves, and then everybody's going to do a short presentation and we're going to join together at the end for some questions. So first of all, I'm going to go over to Huda, just a brief introduction.
Hi, I'm Huda Ammori. I'm a British Palestinian and Iraqi and an activist and one of the founding members of Palestine Action.
Thank you, Huda. Pedro?
Yes, hi, my name is Pedro Inoue. I'm based in São Paulo, Brazil, and I'm the creative director of Adbusters magazine.
Amazing. Robert?
Hi guys, my name is Robert Monoku. I'm a filmmaker, visual artist and writer. I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya. I'm also the founder of a collective called Mau Mau Arts that focuses on the same things and education things.
Great, thank you, Robert. And last but not least, Dan?
Hey, I'm Dan Glass. I'm a very proud activist with In Place of War and Palestine activist as well. But today I'm going to be talking about my activism with ACTUC, which stands for AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power.
Thank you so much, Dan. So yeah, I've been really excited about this session because for me, you know, we're living in a time when we've got kind of a lot of chaos and change and challenges across the world. And I think, you know, for a lot of young people, understanding how they can find their agency and they can be activists is something that people are getting more and more interested in. So I'm really excited to hear from all these different parts of the world, different strategies around creative activism. So I'm going to pass over now to Huda, who's going to do a short presentation about her work. Thanks, Huda.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here and to be amongst these other panelists as well. So I'm going to be focusing on Palestine Action and what we've been doing recently, but I'm going to start off with a bit of an explanation on the history of Palestine and why it's so important that people like myself and others take action in places like the UK and across the world in solidarity. So I'll begin in my own family story. Shortly after the 1920s, which is shortly after the UK handed over the land of Palestine in what they call the Balfour Declaration, which essentially allowed for the colonization of Palestine and allowed for the creation of a Jewish homeland in a place where 97% of the indigenous population were not Jewish, which meant that the only way to create this state was to ethnically cleanse the Palestinian people. It was shortly after this that my great-grandfather was shot and killed by a British soldier. And then we saw several years later, in 1948, with the aid of the British and the West, that the Zionist militia came and ethnically cleansed more than half of the Palestinian population from their homes in what we call the Nakba, which translates into English as the Great Catastrophe. And this system of ethnic cleansing, apartheid, massacring the Palestinian people continues to this very day and was never possible without the support of the UK and other countries across the world. And to this day, countries like the UK continue to profit, sustain, and carry on the system of apartheid over the Palestinian people. If we look at Gaza, for example, Gaza has been under brutal blockade for over a decade, where they're stripped of their basic human rights, and they're not allowed to, people are not allowed to leave or enter, a violation of international law. And since March 2018, Palestinians would go and march to the fence, which has entrapped them under this brutal siege. And Israel would meet them with live fire, sniping down and killing over 250 Palestinian unarmed protesters and injuring over 35,000. And often they would use bullets, which they call butterfly bullets or high velocity bullets, which they shoot at a range and deliberately target young Palestinians, unarmed protesters, in the leg to deliberately disable them. Because when this bullet hits somebody in the leg, the only way it can be treated, because it explodes, is for the leg to be amputated. So on the first day of these protests, we've seen that a young Palestinian 20-year-old footballer had his whole life and career taken away from him for going to demand his rights to freedom. And these bullets and these weapons are being made by companies like Elbit Systems. Companies like Elbit Systems who actually market their weapons as battle tested because they test them on the Palestinian civilians in Gaza who are trapped under this brutal siege, where more than 50% of the population are children and 80% of them are refugees who've been displaced from other parts across Palestine. And we saw in 2014 when they killed over 2,200 Palestinians in 50 days, including over 500 children. And after attacks like this on the population of Gaza, they then market their weapons as tested. And the UK not only buys these weapons, they actually host Elbit Systems factories across the UK. So they have 10 sites across the UK. And this is a continuation of the colonization of Palestine. It's a continuation of the colonial regime and the British Empire. And to this day, we have battle-tested weapons on Palestinians being produced literally right in front of us. In central London, they have offices across the country. They've got factories where they're producing these weapons. And as myself, as a Palestinian who has the privilege of growing up here, I see it as part of our responsibility to use our privilege to take a stand against racism and to stop these weapons where they're being made, because Palestinians don't have a choice. They're on the front line whether they like it or not. But as people internationally, we have an ability to stand in solidarity and to stop these weapons. And we have that privilege and ability to do so without facing bullets or being deliberately disabled for doing so. So just over 3 months ago, myself and others launched a new direct action network called Palestine Action, where we focus on sustained, effective action and targeted at Elbit Systems. And basically our aim is to shut them down, get them forced out of the UK, and to move on to all companies complicit who are profiting off the oppression of the Palestinian people. We've taken action against Elbit over 40 times in the past 3-4 months. And we've grown massively with people across the country now taking action against Elbit, using tactics like ad hacking, throwing red paint across their offices and factories, smashing their windows sometimes as well, and throwing the red paint to symbolize the bloodshed by these companies. You know, they have their HQ in London, which just looks like a normal office block. And the idea of just throwing red paint, it makes it so that they can't hide under the guise of business as usual. They can't continue to, people can't just keep walking past and not knowing what's happening here, and to expose what's happening and to continue to do so and to disrupt their business until it's impossible for them to function here in the UK. And for that, send a message to all companies and institutions who wish to profit off the oppression of the Palestinian people. And often it's not just the oppression of the Palestinian people, it's the Kashmiri people as well, where the Indian occupation is also buying these weapons to use against the occupied people of Kashmir, where the UK authorities are buying these drones to surveil and stop migrants from seeking refuge in the UK. These companies are literally profiting from all forms of oppression. And that's why it's our responsibility as human beings, as people of conscience, to also be intersectional in how we act and to take action against these companies. So I'm going to just briefly show a couple of pictures of different actions that we've done, just to give people an idea. So this is an ad hack that we did quite early on, and actually just this was a taken down ad hack and then painted on the backside of the original ads to kind of say, take up these spaces where corporations are using them for their capitalist purposes, and actually use that to put across our message of solidarity, and also show exactly what these companies are doing in such an overt way, because this is how they market them continuously. This was also put up in Oldham, where they have one of their factories, their key factories in Oldham, which has a very big Asian population. And this actually, even though it's something so simple, did really well and went around the local community, and to the point where the local council actually called an emergency meeting to discuss it because of an ad hack, which just pointed out that this isn't just happening to Palestinians, it's happening to the Kashmiri people, and it's being made here in the UK. And this was one that was done to a bus. It took quite a bit of work to figure out how to do this. Sometimes actually I think doing this is easier to get on the roof of an arms factory sometimes than to attack the side of a bus, but I'll get on to that. And this is the Elbit HQ in London, where as part of Palestine Action, activists went and vandalized what they call vandalized, but through red paint, different paint on the front door. I mean, it kind of says it as it is. And our aim isn't necessarily, arrests, etc. Our aim is to cause disruption and damage to Elbit Systems and associated companies. So a lot of these actions were done and no one was caught doing it, and there were no arrests made, even though that's obviously a risk. And this is when we stormed inside of the Elbit HQ building. They actually were on the 6th floor, so we managed to get to the 6th floor for red paint across the inside, graffiti the inside as well. And these were done actually with, the activists did them with fire extinguishers, where you could put paint and pressurize it and just release it. And this was done on Lascelles, who are the landlords of Elbit's HQ in London, and also Discovery Park, which is again, the landlord is the industrial park where one of their factories is. So trying to drive a wedge between landlords, associated companies, and Elbit Systems with the message, if you aid war criminals, you are war criminals and will be targeted as such. And this was a demo that we had done as well, where we called for public demo, and there was activists who had also planned to do some direct action at the site during the time. Fortunately, myself and others got arrested before the demo actually began, but we still managed to get some red paint on the site. And this was done just a couple of months ago, where a few of us, myself included, went onto the roof of one of their factories in Shenstone, and we occupied the roof of it for about 3-4 days, pouring red paint down the front and smashing the windows all across the front of it as well, which led to the factory close for about 2 weeks, which obviously is a big disruption for a company like Elbit Systems. And we see it as sustained action, not just a one-off action, and where we wait another year before we do another action similarly, because they can account for these things. We want to continue to take sustained direct action until we shut them down, and then move on to ending all complicity with Israeli apartheid. These are details, and that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Huda. That's some really, really inspiring stuff there, and thank you for sharing your strategies with us. I've got loads of questions, but I'll save them till the end. Thank you so much. I'm going to move now on to Pedro.
Huda, thank you so much. That was so inspiring, and so we have a saying here in Brazil that we need more fearless activism, and it's like blood eyes. We call it blood eyes. It's like you have blood in your eyes and you have like so much like power. You're talking about theatrics. I think like what Ruth said, I have so many questions, and it'd be fantastic to talk more. So my presentation is a little bit about imagery. I'll try to kind of like keep it under 10 minutes, like as we say, but let me just share it here. So I quickly want to start with a meme that Adbusters did like a long time ago. I want you guys to name these brands just in your head, yeah? So I'll pass it quickly because this is something quick, that we look at brands and we know exactly what they mean and which corporations we're actually talking about. Now that you name these brands, I want you guys to name these plants, or maybe trees, or maybe insects, and the question is like, why do we recognize thousands and thousands of brand logos and not more than a few tree species? I mean, what kind of mental environment do we live? And when did we all agree that this was this okay? Was this the deal, of this kind of like modern life? So I grew up in an age of excess, so it's like all of my friends were making money, it was the beginning what we call pop culture, consumerist corporate culture, and everyone wanted to sort of like win in life, you know. And so this culture told me that everything was possible as long as I had the money. But deep down, it was telling me that I was alone and I was competing against everything and everyone. This culture told me that the bigger something is, the better is, the shinier something is, the better, the loudest something is, the better. It told me that sugar was good, but no problem, eat lots of sugar. You told me that junk food was good. You told me that I shouldn't worry about plastic, you know. You said that that I had all the choice in the whole world, and that this was a well-functioning system, call it democracy. It also told me that I shouldn't worry, that there were no questions to be asked, just move along. Everything is fine as long as I kept shopping. And so growing up in a society like this, the advertising messages and the images that surround us are always telling us and promising us things. And particularly on my case, all the images that kind of like reached me was always like, you are a powerful individual. You can change the world. You know, the world is ours, you know, and there's so much promise for your future. But actually, reality soon catched up, you know. The world was actually being trashed and caged and burned and slaughtered. And we were never taught, and no one ever taught us how to connect one image with the other. How all these things were kind of like parts of the same world, you know, where in one place it was this fantasy, this promise, you know, this idea of future, but actually it was in reality, was something that was completely different. So Adbusters was founded in 1989. It was an independent force, you know, that was disputing the minds of people using aesthetics and culture as a battleground. This is Kalle Lantz. He's the main editor-in-chief, and back in '89, he founded together with Bill Schmalz the magazine. And so the magazine is a reader-supporter publication with no advertising. And the fact that there's no advertising, that it allows the magazine to be a journey. If you look at any other magazines, the ad breaks, they are like someone, you don't have to pay attention to the ads. So in a sense, you can just flick through the magazine without actually paying attention. But we like to use the ads as a comment to the kind of like mental environment that we create, that we kind of like grow up with. So in that sense, I think that Adbusters could actually be seen as a journey. Maybe it's a journey of the individual times, you know, it's like, what is the story of this individual person that is living through these crazy times? But maybe it could also be the story of humanity. You know, it's like, what is the project that we are doing on planet Earth? You know, why are we doing what we're doing and where we actually headed? You know, the subtitle of the magazine is The Journal of the Mental Environment. So just like we can trash and pollute the rivers and oceans and cut down forests, we can do the same with our minds, you know? So I think it's kind of like important to talk about that the magazine happened during the 90s, and, you know, and during the 90s, image-based culture had a completely new arena to sort of, you were expanding to like unforeseeable ways, you know. There was already a battle to everyone's minds, you know. And this is I think where it kind of like gets interesting, because Adbusters created this culture of subvertisement, of spoof ads, of culture jam, you know. And that's like the hacking concept of getting something that was kind of like that existed in popular culture, you reappropriate it and you kind of like give back to reality. And in a sense, that's like the meme before the meme. You have to understand that this is pre-internet times, you know. And so Adbusters understood that you had to use the magazine as a platform to talk back, you know, because when you live through pre-internet times, you're talking about TV and radio, which is just one way. There's no way you can talk back. So quickly, what the foundation, the Adbusters Foundation, realized that this was all about was kind of like to create campaigns, you know. And the idea that you actually create campaigns, that you launch this idea into the world, and you ask people to sort of organize their own. And it's great because Buy Nothing Day, for example, that it actually happens on Black Friday in the US, and on Saturday the international, we ask people to stay 24 hours without buying anything. And it's amazing, like how people in Japan took on a life of its own. In London, they did completely different things, you know. It becomes like a festival, you know. And the idea is to let go, you know. It's like Adbusters doesn't want to sort of be credit for that. You just want to spark the idea, and people sort of take it and go it and do something like this. And I think that the letting go part is interesting, because it's kind of like almost like is a muscle that needs to be flexed every day, you know. The idea of how do you learn to let go, you know. Which brings me to our kind of like a most successful campaign that we had back in 2011. We were in Spanish. We were inspired by the Spanish Encampadas and the Arab Spring, and the magazine printed this poster in August 2011. And this is it. It said, "What is our one demand?" It had the ballerina and the bow, hashtag Occupy Wall Street, September 17th, bring 10th. And I think that the most interesting thing for me is that the whole Occupy movement that went out to be like a global movement started off out of this one single image that we're actually looking at, you know. And I think that says so much about the world that we live in, when just one image can actually create such a movement, you know. And kind of like goes to, for me, is like, what is the power of this one image that we sort of like in this kind of like society that we're living through, you know. We have to understand that we are living in a moment in history of humanity that there's more information out there than any other time in the history of humanity. You know, it's like, can you imagine, it's like the amount of information in the stratosphere? There's 350 PowerPoint presentations being done at every second. It's like greenhouse gas emissions on a psyche level, you know. It's like global warming inside our heads, you know. And what are the consequences of this overload? You know, what are the consequences of this amount of information? You know, that's very important. We have no defense mechanism against, you know. This is John Berger. John Berger talks a lot about this. It's almost like you can choose not to read a text, but you cannot do that with an image, you know. And no image, when the image, they come in no matter what, and there's no way to kind of like stop the image. And the only way to stop the image is to actually read deeper and to understand what we're actually looking at, you know. So John Berger said something really interesting, that he said that all the images that we see are influenced by our ideas of beauty, of truth, of taste, of class, and gender. No image, it's innocent. You know, there's always a bias. You know, we see what we look at, and to look is an act of choice. You know, I'll give you a typical example, you know, of the Mercator map. You know, the Mercator map, if you think of the globe and how do you transform the globe into an actual 2D physical kind of like a flat map, you have to come up with the idea of what is south, what is north, what is below, what's above. And in a globe kind of going in space, there's no above or below, there's no left or right, you know. And you have to kind of like put that down. This map in particular that we see in a lot of classrooms around the world, you know, that map was drawn in 1569. It's nautical ends because it's using straight lines. Europe, it's at its center. Africa and South America are distorted because of the sizes. So basically, when you show this map, you're telling a world view that is imperialistic, there is colonial, there's European, and there is white. You know, and this is something that we are not used to, looking at an image, kind of like questioning deeper and try to understand what we're actually looking at. You know, so but maybe again, it's not the power of the image we should actually be looking at. Maybe it's the power of the stories, you know, that we sort of like live through. You know, it's like we live among gazillions and gazillions of narratives, you know, again, more than any other time they sort of lived, you know. And I'm asking, like, all these ideas are told by journalists, economists, media, politicians, etc. And what underlines these stories? You know, how can we sort of like read deeper and understand what are they sort of proposing, you know? And we often forget that capitalism itself is a story. You know, it's a myth. It's an idea. You know, and our world is still shaped by stories. This is why creativity is as dangerous as never before, because it's the most uncontrollable of the human forces. You know, every leader is a symbol. Every government is a brand. And we are right now, we are at a time that we're living through meme wars, you know, and there's where the horizontality of the network, suddenly one idea and one person can have a seismic mind bomb at an international scale, and everything is connected, you know. Masanobu Fukuoka is a writer that he wrote this book called One Straw Revolution, and he said something that is really interesting. He said that you can't use pesticides because pesticides kill spiders. And without spiders, you don't have the webs in their plantations. Without their webs, you don't have the drops of dew in the early mornings. And without these drops of dew in the early mornings, you don't have the sunlight going through them and shining on your plantation. And without this light, you have no poetry. And that kind of like reminds me a little bit of what someone said about design. And he said that you never design just a chair. You always design a chair in the room in the house, a house in the street, a street in the city, a city in the country, a country in the world. And it's about sort of trying to understand all these steps and reading deeper, you know. It's about the chair, is about the words, about poetry, it's about the accents that we sort of live through, you know, that we're sort of like able to lose control, you know. And I just kind of just want to finish with this one thing that I've been kind of like working on it a lot, is that we just have to remember that Mothership Earth is on fucking fire. You know, there's nothing else to debate. You know, the future that we're giving to the kids, you know, it's like, so if they're angry, we have to give them space. So don't lose heart. Remember to dance. Not everything is lost. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Pedro. That was amazing. That was incredible. It's really interesting to me opening with the brands, because you're right, but we don't get to choose that, do we? We don't get to choose whether or not we know this, and yet we know I knew all of those brands. So that's quite frightening. So yeah, but thank you so much for that presentation. Again, loads of questions, but we'll come to them at the end. I'm going to pass now over to Kenya, Nairobi, and to Robert.
Hi guys, thank you again. But I was really moved by what you said, Huda. It's really crazy because 3 years ago here in Nairobi, we actually stood in solidarity with Palestinians. Well, some of us did. So we were saying we are one with Palestinians. And at the time, we felt like the politics behind the West Bank and all that's happening is a bit skewed. So hearing stories of activism on the ground is really, I know that things can get that way. What you said about the weapons is really devastating to hear. So thank you for sharing. I'll also be sure to share that. And also, Pedro, thank you so much. You basically summarized the dark side of capitalism. And it's funny that because a day ago, I was telling a friend of mine that that's basically what capitalism is. It's just trying to make us like consume, like perpetual consumers. So today they'll create something, tomorrow they'll create something new, what they created, and then they try to pursue to keep consuming. And usually it's at the detriment of the environment and those who are consuming it. So for me today, I think I would like to talk a bit about the situation here in Kenya, because I feel that's what I need. I have a responsibility to address. So many issues, but I'll just pick one. And this issue is actually the genesis of every issue, if it were properly analyzed, and this is corruption. And corruption didn't begin yesterday in this country. It began with the colonial government, with the British colonial government. It wasn't corruption then, more of brutality and more of conquest. But what happened is during the time when the freedom fighters, which our organization is named after Mau Mau, the Mau Mau were the freedom fighters, or a group of the freedom fighters in Kenya. Around that time, there was also a political class that kind of got away with, for lack of a better word, selling out. So when all was said and done, the Mau Mau, who are the real freedom fighters, who are the people who were actually outright doing what, like, who you're doing with your group, the people who are like in the bush fighting, the people who are actually trying to get the land back from the British, are the people who got the worst deal and who got the worst reputation. And the people who got the best reputation as now the freedom fighters in quotes are sadly the people whose families still today run this country, are the people who are lauded as heroes, the people who are seen as having driven off the British, the people who brought development to our country. But the truth is, these guys were sellouts, and they basically inherited the colonial government's techniques of divide and rule. So what happened? Being heterogeneous ethnic nation, we have about 70 subcategorizations of communities living in this country, and about 44 officially registered ethnic communities in a very small country, if you think about it, because you look to Rwanda, who had only 2 communities, it's a big difference. So what the political elite did around that time we got independence, when the British conceded, is they just took on, they inherited the British divide and rule technique. They inherited the British way of plunder. And what they did is they used the existence of these ethnic communities to create discord. At that time, we had there was something called the Kennedy Airlift. Around that time in the 60s, Kennedy, with one of the now real leaders in this country called Tom Mboya, had an arrangement where people from Kenya could go and stay in the United States, and it was called the JF Kennedy, I think, Airlift. And one of the beneficiaries is the late Nobel laureate Wangari Maathai, who was an environmentalist. So we had this class of people who were born around the 1940s and 1930s, being taken to the United States to learn, and they came back later and they became the pioneers of what would be the development class, or the new what they call the young guys of this country who would bring about change. But likewise, at the same time, there was competition between this class, and the competition came about in terms of who was to access resources, who was to lay claim to leadership. So what happened is the government of the ended up doing a lot of political assassinations, a lot of plunder, and that lingered on till today. When you talk about the 1980s, we had an attempted coup when the first president was killed like 4 years later. And ever since that time, 1982 up to 24 years later, basically, or close to 20 years later, we had one president. And that one president was our second president. Between 1982 and 1991, we had multi-party rule in this country. Basically, we were not a democracy, whatever democracy means, but we were a single party. In 1991, because of the end of the Cold War, and obviously we have the likes of the Americas and the West trying to kind of, like win over some of these states they had in Africa. We had like the capitalism was booming at the time. So most African leaders were being wooed by the West, being wooed by America. Russia, the USSR collapsed to kind of get into agreements. And this was the era of the SAPs, the SAP structural adjustment programs, where we would literally like sell out our country, and we were looking to private key areas of our economy, areas that you need private. So at that time, there was a push, and there was pressure on our then president to give to cede to this demand call for multipartism. So 1991, there was multipartism declared through a constitutional amendment, and after we had different political parties other than the main political party, notwithstanding for the next close to 10 years, they were rigging elections anyway. But key landmark in our history was in 2002, when the opposition came together and they threw out this president, who was our second president. At that time, tribalism was suspended. And at that time, Kenyans did not care who is what tribe or what. People were just fed up of the plunder, they were fed up of the stealing. Between 1992 and 2002, 18 years old in 2002. and I had only seen one president my whole life up to 2002, and I voted, by the way, at that time. So at that time, Kenya was a pariah, because this president was actually he had driven our economy to a shambles. There were a lot of human rights violations. People could not say anything. Like what I'm saying right now, tomorrow I would be dead. And this is what people were with. Sadly, this did not last. And 3 years after 2002, it was back to the same thing. The political leaders who would come together, they became selfish, or maybe they were selfish all along because they just wanted to remove this one guy, and they started fighting amongst themselves, and they resorted to the same thing, using divide and rule. And as we speak, fast forward to today, Kenya remains one of the most ethnically sensitive in terms of the diverse communities that we have, nations in East Africa. And every election brings with it fears of violence, of post-election violence based on ethnicity. So the key to here is how politicians use divide and rule based on the ethnic communities to create discord, to continue the culture of poverty, because Kenyans are really getting into a tough economic time. Right now, the cost of living is over the roof in this country. The middle class is literally closer to being poor than ever before. With the pandemic and in an economy that depends mostly on informal businesses, or what you call the blue collar economy, and now with the lockdowns, with the curfews, with the restrictions of movement, the economy is in a shambles. So that's, I think, what I wanted to bring on to talk about today. I think that's more or less putting it out there, and also saying that to end this, we need to interrogate the families that rule this country, because unless we change that, it will continue. And sadly, that's what it is. What it is right now. We'll see families continue running this country. They'll keep us poor. They'll pretend that they care, but being kept poor so that they can keep dividing us, and so that they can keep run this country as families, as bias, and so on. And so I think that's all I wanted to share today. And our organization, in a parting shot, we basically use art to kind of highlight these issues. We use film, we use graffiti, and we use satire, and that's what we are good at, and that's what we hope to use to kind of change the narrative. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert, for sharing that. I think we'll dig in a little deeper into the kind of strategies and kind of arts-based interventions that you guys do after we've heard from Dan. So Dan, over to you.
Thanks. I don't know how I'm going to follow all of that. Thanks so much. I think this conversation is so important at the moment when we're living in, like you said, the age of corruption, more than ever, deceit, confusion, people turning in on each other. This is such a good opportunity to sharpen the saw when it comes to creative activism. And it's so good to see our other speakers. I just want to say thank you, Huda. Always so good to see you, mate. And also, you know, the work that you do is just relentless. It's Palestine Day, a week today, which is good in a way that we remember Palestine, but we shouldn't fucking do it on one day of the year. We should be like taking action 365 days a year like you do. Pedro, like everything you do with Adbusters. Without you, when I was a teenager, when I found Adbusters, and I was just reading crap, misogynistic stuff like FHM and Loaded, like Adbusters properly changed my world. And thank you, Robert, for just reminding us about the importance of interrogating the root of what we do, and obviously the etymology of radical being root. If we get to the symptom, you know, we need to get to the root of everything rather than the symptom of nothing. And I think that's probably a common overlap in our activism, to dig deeper, get to the root of all the injustices that we face, which is often the British Empire. I am an activist with AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power and a few other things, but what's close to me at my heart at the moment is HIV activism. Is World AIDS Day on December the 1st, where we remember the dead and fight for the living, the 36 million people across the world who've died because of government inaction and pharmaceutical greed. And the original aim and ongoing aim of AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power is until there is healthcare for all. And we're so far from that. And the root causes of the HIV pandemic and the COVID pandemic are very much the same in so many ways. And hopefully we can touch on that a bit. I think one commonality between all of our activism is the personal is political, that transformation starts with ourselves. And on many different angles, similar to Huda, our connections, our histories are very much overlapped. I'm Jewish, my grandparents were Holocaust survivors. And if there's anything I will do in my short time on the planet is not let the Holocaust happen to anyone else and their story be manipulated and utilized to oppress other people in Palestine. And living with HIV for now a long time, 15, 14 years or something, you know, I realized that art was a tool of survival for me. That often, if we don't have a creative outlet, we turn in on ourselves. So ACT UP saved my life when I found out about them. But I've just got a few pictures. I feel a bit like I'm paying tribute to Neil Buchanan from Art Attack, which is a British TV show, because I drew them myself. I'm a big fan of popular education, which is the opposite of banking education, which is the formative education, which makes us all passive, submissive, and regurgitating the capitalist, patriarchal, colonialist crap that we're fed. Here's a picture. Picture number one is the kind of animation of popular education. This is, sorry, the animation of banking education, which is the formative education that most of us get, that we're seen as empty vessels to be fed by dominator culture, that we can't speak for ourselves. And if anyone knows, particularly people who are oppressed by dominator culture, we can very well speak for ourselves and we can ask questions for ourselves. And the essence of popular education, which is born out of the country where Pedro is from, out of Brazil, is to cultivate curiosity, to dig deeper, to ask the question, but why, but why, but why? And when you're living in a dominated culture, asking questions is exactly not what they want. We're told to stop asking so many questions and shut up, basically. But asking questions is the most essential thing to cultivate curiosity and to change the world. So if you are at school age and you're listening to this, go to school tomorrow and ask all the questions, because that's exactly what we should be doing. Here's a picture of, just to say, a lot of these exercises are from two of my favorite toolkits, Training for Transformation, which is born out of the Black consciousness movement and popular education. And we utilized a lot in the anti-apartheid movement. And Beautiful Trouble, which is a now global art activism toolkit. You can find all the toolkits online, beautifultrouble.org. And these are just a few of the thousands of exercises. This is what's called the Holon, where as agents of change, we should ideally be thinking on 4 levels simultaneously, all at once. When we're trying to, which you do in Adbusters so beautifully, particularly with, you know, the Occupy image, for example, where we should be thinking on the first kind of sphere is self to self, transformation starts with ourselves. Secondly, our communities, like our literal neighborhoods. Thirdly, our societies, whether that's our city, our country. And 4, on a universal level. And social change happens on all areas all at once. That's what we should be aiming towards. And when we connect with ourselves on the personal level, it resonates across the world. This is another of my favorites, which is an animation of a bird in a cage, which is the kind of relationship between the oppressed and the oppressor consciousness, which is a key kind of concept within popular education, how we all have the ability to be the oppressed and the oppressor. And if we're not careful, we'll as the oppressed, we'll step into the shoes of the oppressor. That's classic victimhood mentality, which we see in a lot of the contexts that we organize around. Here's one of my favorite quotes from the civil rights poet and author, Maya Angelou. The cage bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still, and her tune is heard on the distant hill, for the cage bird sings of freedom. So basically, draw a bird in a cage and see how it resonates with you. are we our own worst enemy? And if we are our own worst enemy within closing ourselves in our own cage, how can we get out of the cage? Is the door open, and how can we boot ourselves out of the cage? What does the bird represent? What does the perch represent? What does the food represent? What do the grates on the cage represent in terms of the things which oppress us, and they might be ourselves, and how can we break out of that? Two last training for transformation exercises before I go on to ACT UP. This is one of my favorites, like, which is what you all do so beautifully. Like in the digging deeper process, the questioning process, the consciousness raising process, how can we deepen consciousness? How can we cultivate levels of awareness? And this is called the 4 levels of awareness. And essentially, as agents of change, how can we enable ourselves and our communities to move from naive consciousness to questioning consciousness, to liberating consciousness, to transforming consciousness? And let's take the example of Palestine. When you go to a lot of places in Palestine, you will see on one side of the street, I'm thinking of the Jordan Valley in particular, in Palestine, on the Palestinian side of the street, parched ground with no access to water. On the other side of the ground, you'll see beautiful water-rich gardens. So living in naive consciousness, which is easy to do when we're just completely oppressed by domination, a manifestation of naive consciousness might be like, oh, well, it's just our bad luck that we don't have access to water. That's what God would have wanted. Then as a community activist, as a facilitator, as an artist, it's the first stage of questioning. Yeah, but why do we not have access to water, and why do they have access to water on that side of the street? Then the next stage is liberating consciousness. Well, when did the hydrological systems get manipulated? When did it change? And who was behind that change? Which water companies, and who owns those water companies? And then the final stage, and this is obviously a short summary, but the final stage is the transformative stage of development, which is, hang on, we're going to create our own hydrological water systems, because clearly the systems are set against us. They're not going to give us water because they want us to die out. So we're going to try and create our own water systems, or in many other cases, our own communication systems, like in Adbusters, or food sovereignty, or education methods. So that's naive to questioning, to liberating, to transformation. And then the last one is essentially how we can go from functional areas of development to structural change. So in classic NGOization, there's an amazing article by Arundhati Roy called NGOization of Resistance. Classic charity culture is often seen as like welfare approach, like the help the poor approach. And then we need to move to the development approach, which is the kind of classic mantra of helping people to help themselves. Then to liberation, which is denouncing evil. And then finally to transformation, which is like scrap chucking us the crumbs off the table. We're going to kick the whole table over and make it all anew. So they're just some of the key kind of transformative tools which really inspire me to do the organizing that I do. Then I just particularly wanted to talk about ACT UP, one of the most prolific, creative art activist movements in recent history, in my humble opinion, who started in 1983 in America and have chapters across the world, in not waiting for the government to make changes when people are dying left, right, and centre because of the HIV and AIDS epidemic. I've just drawn a few pictures of some of my favourite actions. First of all, starting off, when you'll have to remind me because I'll ramble on about ACT UP forever. One of my favorite actions, which was in 1992, which is called the Ashes Action. One of the key things when it comes to the power of actions, I find, is emotions. There's an amazing book called ACT UP Emotions by Deborah Gould. In activism, you have to have a balance between the head, the heart, and the hand. The intellectual understanding of the injustice, how it impacts us emotionally, and the hand, what we can do. The trick is having them all in balance. If you're too stuck in the head, you'll be an armchair activist. If you're too stuck in the heart, you won't get out of bed in the morning because it's too depressing. If you're too stuck in the hand, you'll just be knee-jerk and reactionary. We all have a natural tendency to inhabit one, once you recognize one, I know that I'm a heart-orientated person, you'll have that balance. Okay, 1 minute. So that's, so one of the essence of the Ashes Action was when people threw the ashes of their loved ones over the White House gates, utilizing the emotion of grief in a powerful act of alchemy in transformation, to take the war home to the White House gates, where they threw the ashes of their loved ones over it and said, we will not stand for your inaction anymore. That's the Ashes Action. Here's a picture of a giant pile of horse shit with a World AIDS Day ribbon over it, which is what I took along with my boyfriend, another activist to Nigel Farage, who's was at the time the head of UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party, who are a far-right fascist party in Britain. At the time, they were saying, frankly, migrants living with HIV are the last kind of migrants we should allow into the UK. So we took half a ton of shit to their offices in South London and dumped it at 5 o'clock in the morning on World AIDS Day with a banner over it, which said, with a World AIDS Day ribbon over it and a banner attached to their garage, which said, what goes around comes around, stop spreading filth, solidarity on World AIDS Day. And they got kicked out of their offices, which was more than we could have ever asked for. And last one is one of my favorite ACT UP actions, which was from New York in the 90s, I believe. Here it says, money for AIDS, not war. And it's a banner with helium balloons attached to it, which they let go in Grand Central Station in New York. And nothing beats the power of helium balloons attached to banners taken into places that you want to disrupt business as usual. And the power of that is that they connected the machinery of oppression, said, why are you funding the defense and war budget when we need healthcare? And I think the final note is all injustices are connected. And that's particularly in this day and age what we have to dig at.
Wow. Wow, thank you all so much. It's just so inspiring to hear all of you speak and all of your amazing actions. And you know, without people like you, change doesn't happen. I'm gonna begin by, I guess, just putting a question to all of you. Dan, you mentioned that the personal is political, and what I'd like to know is really about how we decide the activism that we are involved in. So how do we decide on what our activism looks like? How do we decide what is the change we all want to see in the world? Or is this something that we do we do this on our own, or do we do this with others? And I guess, so how do we build that story either individually or together? Is it about attaching yourself to an existing movement, or is it about starting your own movement? And then how do you galvanize people around, if you're starting something from scratch, you know, something new, how do you start to even, you know, begin to galvanize people around your idea? So that's really a question about where does it begin, I guess, on the activist journey. So that's open for all of you guys.
Yeah, I think for me it was quite, I was born into like a family with a Palestinian father, an Iraqi mother, all my family living in the Middle East, and growing up always knowing about the privilege that I had growing up in the UK, and also knowing, you know, the oppression that they were under constantly, not being able to go see them, and hearing the different things that was happening, and just growing up with a big sense of frustration, especially when I started going to university, seeing that the university I was going to was investing in companies which were complicit in the oppression of the Palestinian people, making partnerships with Israeli institutions who were the research hub essentially for companies like Elbit Systems. Just became so extremely frustrated with doing different forms of activism, whether that was divestment, starting off with, you know, petitions, banner drops, things like that. Focusing on whatever I could because I was just so frustrated. And then getting to a point when you start to realize, okay, if this, a lot of times in the activism I did beforehand at university to change things, or appealing to the UK government, or being told, you know, the best way to do it is to go lobby my local MP, when actually you come to realize, okay, if this same system is the reason that we have these issues in the first place, and they're continuing to maintain it. And you start to understand that actually it's more convenient. It's not that there's lack of education. I think a lot of time for parliamentarians, I think they know exactly what's going on, but it's easier to turn a blind eye to these issues. It's easier to benefit from it. So I think myself, the person not being political, was realizing that I had a lot of privilege being in the UK. And then if I had that privilege and it was a democracy, like they call it, then surely you should be able to make some change through that. And actually deciding to go and empower myself and others around me to go and do direct action and take the power back into our own hands, where we go, we're not going to wait around for the people who continue to sustain this colonialism across the world to change things, and to put the power back into the hands of the people. And I think just starting by empowering yourself and going out and doing those things and making the changes that you want to see, then other people find it refreshing and join in. And that's how we build a movement, and realizing that not only are you empowering yourself by doing something and going out there and taking direct action against these companies and changing what you want to change, but also you're bringing alongside other people with you, and you're making hopefully sustainable and real change for people across the world. So by empowering ourselves, we can also make real dynamic change for people who've been suffering under the British Empire for decades, if not centuries.
Great, thank you so much, Huda. Dan?
Oh, great question. I think there's a few ways to answer that. I think the first one is, I'm sure we've all been in a space where we get really frustrated that people, when we're getting angry about a situation and people aren't jumping on our bandwagon. We all know life's so short. So instead of being like waiting and getting frustrated that people aren't jumping on your bandwagon, just role model the work, like Huda says, role model the world that you want to create. Start the project, learn by doing, like work in a process, like feed forward rather than feedback, which is like what is good and what could be better next time, because we have to be activists for the rest of our lives in a healthy, holistic way. So just start creating the projects and see how it resonates. Role modeling is that kind of key concept. I think the other element is like the relational activism. We've talked about this before, Ruth. Of course, we're all big fans of like iconic, audacious actions. But one thing that one of my dear friends once said to me is that 90% of the efficacy of transformation comes from the everyday acts of love and solidarity. Having a cup of tea with your mate who's really depressed, who might be facing evictions, going to the hospital with your friend who's got to pick up their HIV medication, who doesn't have anyone else to go with. The everyday acts of solidarity. The penultimate point is being, obviously we all know that the most oppressed have to lead the issue themselves that's oppressing them. But there's the role of allies. And it, again, relating to World AIDS Day, one thing that always stuck with me, which I heard, like, I don't know, 10 years ago in an HIV activist meeting, one guy stood up to this other guy and said, "You've got no right to talk because you've got HIV negative privilege." And I was like, what? The whole point of being an HIV activist is we don't want people to get HIV. That's the point. So we have to challenge a lot of the oppression Olympics, I find, and enable a culture where, yeah, as the people who are affected by the injustice, we have to lead it, but building space for people to support and be allies in the ways that they can and cultivate those skill sets. And lastly, I think it's just being an activist or being a human is just recognizing the daily joys that we have amongst all the oppressions that we face. And there's a tattoo that I've got on my arm, which is one of my favorite writers called Etty Hillesum, who was in the same transit camp as one of my grandparents, who were all Holocaust survivors. She died in Auschwitz, age 29, and she was a pioneer of living with hope and wonder, even when we're facing such struggles. And the quote is, "We may be sad and depressed by what has been done to us. That is only human and understandable. But we ourselves are our own worst enemy if we inflict the pain upon ourselves. I find life beautiful and I feel free. The sky within me is as wide as the stretching above my head." She died in Auschwitz, age 29, but she made damn sure that every day before that, she would have a laugh even when and like support others even when she knew what would probably happen.
Wow, amazing. Thank you so much, Dan. Pedro.
This is so inspiring, people. Thank you so much for this. This is like it's not my typical Saturday Sunday morning, but it's amazing. I want to pick up on a few things that Huda and Dan spoke about. I think it's important as well for us to put the context of the kind of world that we're living in. You know, I mean, we have the same, the dates that Huda talked about, the dates that Dan talked about. They're like 30 years, 40 years, 50 years ago. And in a sense, we have the history repeating itself. But because of the amount of information we have, there's more context. We kind of understand that these things are kind of like repeating themselves, you know? And I think that this is the timing for actions are super, super important, because all of a sudden we can understand it's like people are fed up. You know, I think that what's happening with the current government that we have here, Jair Bolsonaro is a far-right government, a little bit in the UK with Boris and the Trump government, they're kind of like related in the sense of kind of like people are fed up. They want to try something different, you know, and then you have the far right in a sense kind of like invaded in as the anti-establishment. They managed to kind of hijack that idea in a sense, you know. So I think it's the game. It's changing really quick, and I think that again we have the power to inspire people, you know, be it with bold action by kind of like showing the connections, going deeper, reading deeper, telling, you know, like, oh, you're consuming this is connected with this is connected with that. Exactly. Like I love that piece of that phrase that Huda put it on her on one of the actions that you said, if you aid war criminals, you are a war criminal. We have to build these bridges and make sure these things are connected, you know, and we understand the word deeper now. We can know how the backstage works in that sense. So I think that the timing for now for all these actions is super important. Another thing is that we have to understand the power of communication, you know, like how Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro used WhatsApp and fake news as terms of narratives to kind of like build upon, you know. And I think that, and again, I remember like there's this story, which is like this one guy who wants to help a friend who has a disease and decides to make this challenge, and which is he's throw a bucket full of ice in his head. You know, there was one guy having one idea, and all of a sudden, boom, it's all over the world, and everybody's kind of like, help me, and everyone's doing it. You know, so I think it's beautiful that we have the possibility of kind of like making things so wild and so big. But I do as well want I don't want to kind of like say that only ideas like these counts, you know, because I guess like going back, especially during COVID times, I don't know how you guys are feeling about that, but my anxiety levels are like super high. I get emotional with like any sort of commercial I see. And I think that it goes back to individual, which it kind of like goes back what Dan was saying, which is kind of like it really it's about the daily lives that we live in and how we look people in the eye and how we stop and do things, you know, with truly what's in our hearts in that sense, you know. So I think it's a daily battle, you know. Again, it's not the objective. There's no objective. We're going to be activists for the rest of our lives, you know. I'm looking forward for a panel in 20 years time so we can all see like what we're doing, how we're doing, you know, where we're heading. But I do think that there's like that's what the people on our sides, our friends, and how we sort of help our sense of hope and self-care, I think is super important to kind of like put it out there.
Thank you so much, Pedro. And I think, you know, just to echo that again, Dan and I talked about this a while ago. And I think for me, without dialogue, you can't really make change. And I think that dialogue can start with conversations with people on your street. And I've seen that during COVID, people coming together who would never normally speak to each other, who'd never normally connect with each other. So actually the pandemic has kind of maybe forced us to connect in ways we haven't done in the past. And I think that can really begin to bring around change. Robert, I don't know if you want to come in on that question.
Yeah, well, I just want to mention that especially here in Kenya, what I've seen works and what has worked with what we do is grassroots organizing. Basically, that's what Dan showed. I liked the way you put it in the staircase because basically that's more or less what we try to do. I think the biggest gap we have here is how information flows, and the government takes advantage of that flow or lack thereof to kind of steer the conversation in a certain way. And just to give an example, when we did the COVID-19 awareness project on mental health within place of war, we had a number of people writing in to us, even till today, saying, asking who we are, the people who even did not know Mau Mau arts, and asking, who are you guys? Are you guys a mental health awareness organization? Because severally we faced this stigma. We have social workers from the government in our community, but they did not really get to us. Those are some of the words we hear. They did not get to us the way you did. So this is very telling about some of the techniques we use in kind of reaching the grassroots, because I believe in any society, let alone Kenya, the grassroots is where organizing has the most effect, especially if you're looking to touch on to policy. So I feel if anything is to give, we need to kind of rethink how we organize around some of these issues in the community.
Thank you so much, Robert. I want to move on. I'm conscious of time. I wanted to talk about kind of, I guess, response and impact of the work that you guys do. What does a successful campaign result in? What does, do you ever have negative responses, for example, from brands, Pedro? Do you ever have negative responses from the state, Robert? So really the question is about what is the impact of a campaign, of a something that you guys put together? And is there any negative consequences, I guess, or challenges that you faced? Maybe starting with Huda.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I feel like with what, especially recently with Palestine Action, we faced a lot of groups trying to stop what we're doing. I think three weeks in, we had the Israeli Minister of Strategic Affairs meet Dominic Raab in Israel, where they mentioned our group and asked for them to shut us down, and said that they wanted to be able to continue doing business in London. And I mean, for me, when I found that, I was on a pro-Israel news site, I was elated, because I was just like, wow, you feel like I'm doing something which is reaching these people, and they must be running scared. And obviously, if these people are running scared and trying to stop us, it means what we're doing has the potential to work and go further. So we're obviously on the right path. But that obviously has other implications where we have extreme police violence against us. I mean, compared to other countries, and especially the countries that we're in solidarity with, it seems like nothing. But then compared to environmental direct action protests that happen in the UK, you can see the stark contrast where, you go for a bucket of red paint and you get thrown onto the ground straight away and cut behind your back, whereas you see the other protesters get cuffs in front of them, etc. And it's a completely different experience, not even just for brown and black people who take part in our actions, but also for the English people, because they're the white people, because they're taking action under a banner of Palestine Action, which was shocking for me to see as well. But obviously they are completely racist. But as well, it's not just even, we get it from that. Facebook tried to ban our pages recently. GoFundMe won't put up our pages. And then we find groups even like Open Collective, which came out because of COVID, and mutual aid groups to support the accounting system, who then stop our donations at the peak of our donations. So on Balfour Day, which commemorates the 100 years since the Balfour Declaration, 103 years it was, on November 2nd, where we had many actions planned across the UK. At the peak of our actions, they got a complaint from Lawyers for Israel and decided to block our donations immediately, which obviously at the peak of your actions stops a lot of donations coming in. And this is a group which is, again, supposed to be supporting grassroots, etc. So I think when you're doing something which is pushing the line and pushing things further, and you are going to face so many challenges, but at the same time, that also makes us think, you know, what we're doing is the right thing. And if we just keep pushing forward and trying to push past these obstacles, and the biggest thing about these obstacles is that they want to detract you from what you're doing. They want to distract you so that you're taken away from what you've been doing in the first place. I think continuing to plow forward, finding different ways around it and saying we're not going to rely on any third-party platforms. We're going to build our own systems in place so we don't need to rely on these other things. And our supporters we are growing constantly. People are joining us all the time, growing in popularity, and the support is growing from the people, from grassroots people, maybe not by, you know, mainstream capitalist organizations like Facebook or bank accounts or all of those kind of things, but in terms of the actual grassroots. And that's what we want. And that's our whole thing, is to empower people to take the power back into their own hands. So I think in that way, you know, we can say, bring it on. We're not going to stop. We're going to continue to go forward, and we're not going to stop until we shut these war criminals down, force them out, and move on to every single company who is profiting from this, because it's just got to end. And the contrast between the fact that Facebook say, you know, we're promoting harm, that's what they say, promoting harm, promoting crime, for throwing red paint over a factory who tests their weapons on children. And Elbit Systems have got Facebook marketing their weapons all the time, etc. They have no issues. I've reported them for promoting violence, and nothing happens, you know, because this is the difference. But I think when we realize how crazy it is, you have no choice but to act and keep going forward.
Absolutely. It's madness, isn't it? When you put it like that, it just is madness completely. And I think you're right. I think, you know, a lot of the time to stop activism is to make your life as hard as possible, to distract you and make you caught up in either legal cases or other struggles that distract you from what you're actually, you know, what they're scared of, I guess. Pedro, obviously taking on multinational corporations is probably quite a frightening thing to do, given the power that they hold. Have you ever faced any response from any of those brands, corporations?
In the beginning, Adbusters did. There was a couple of corporations from the spoof ads that he kind of created that he came afterwards. They came back at Adbusters. Adbusters actually started as the beginning of Adbusters actually was a response to an advertising that was running around. The Canadian logging industry had an advertising back in the 80s, which was in order to save a forest, you have to cut down this forest. It was like one of those classical, you know, like mental mindfucks like that advertising usually do. And basically what happened was that they decided to create an advert in response to this advert and kind of run it. And then they realized that CBC, the Canadian Broadcast Corporation, didn't allow it to air it because they were not kind of like so again, they have all these kind of privileges as well, which is like, if you want to play the game, you have to play the game. And I think it's perfect when Huda says about the Facebook, which is the same kind of privileges, but in a sense kind of just updated for today's world. You know, who gives more money? Is it Huda Groups or is it the actual, you know, manufacturers company? You know, and I guess like when we start reading deeper and questioning these things, you know, and putting it in the way that she's so to put, what does vandalism means? And what is this? What is the kind of vandalism? Is vandalism throwing red paint or killing children? You know, when we actually say it like this, it's a problem of kind of like finding the correct metaphors to really make people understand, be it in irony, be it with making jokes, be it like in a spoof ad, kind of like making people confused, is this an action advert or it's not? You know, I would like to kind of like put up the work of Bill Posters as well. He's doing like with deep fake, which is fantastic, you know, kind of like really mixing it up. You know, what are these powerful celebrities saying different things that kind of like goes deeper into that, you know. And I think that a lot of the corporations that came after us, we made so much noise that they kind of stepped back, you know, because again, it's almost like this is an important thing, guys. It's and this is what maybe just getting out there and see if this kind of like provokes anything on all of you. But Trump got elected mainly because he managed to keep his name being running over and over and over and over. You know, it's like the system that capitalists created was the fact that the more you say someone's name, be it good or bad, you know, the more publicity you give to this person. You know, in that sense, what you want to keep doing is that you keep on the top of the narrative, kind of like really framing the narrative and putting out there for people to sort of discuss. You know, sometimes there's like bad actions and there's some like negativity. It's like some things happen that we're not dealing with how can I say, it's not a fair game. You know, it's like we're not dealing with great, you know, people that are like playing a game and they're playing, you know, they're playing dirty. They have much more money than any of us could all have. You know, they have control of the networks, they have control of the communication means and so forth, you know, and they play dirty. So it's kind of like, but what do we have in our hands? And I think we spoke about this before, Ruth. We have inspiration, we have storytelling, we have culture. And that's, I mean, you don't see films about the government in Kenya, the corrupt government in Kenya winning. Hey, you know, we don't see films about kind of like, or stories or poetry about this, you know. So I think there's so much more in terms of the storytelling that we sort of should use and should hack into in that sense. You know, this is so inspiring to hear the story and to kind of get to understand, and you understand about injustice and you kind of go, no, this is wrong, you know. And people, I feel they are much more open for that. The next generation of activists, you know, it's like, it's amazing to see the energy they're sort of bringing in, be it from climate, from human rights, from the indigenous folk, sorts of like, it's amazing to see like the anger and at the same time, the kind of fierceness that they want to sort of bring in, you know. So I don't know if I answered, but I kind of ran well about, sorry.
That was amazing. I want to go to Robert, as you mentioned Kenya there, and just ask Robert about, I guess a lot of your work is about fixing the divisions imposed by the state. And have you ever had a response? And I guess the response from the state, either negative or positive, I guess it would be negative in the work.
Yeah, well, here it's become more of a kind of a subtle warfare, because what they do is they cripple you systemically. They make sure you don't get. Nairobi is a very small city, and it's the capital city. By any standards, we are very few. In less than a day, you can exhaust all areas in Nairobi. I mean, you missed that during the arts-based education, but Nairobi is very small. So if the government wants to cripple you as an individual or as an organization, they do it very fast, systemically. And by this, I mean, you'll not get any contracts. If you're a filmmaker, you'll not get contracts. If you're looking for jobs, you'll not get jobs. And like closer home in the work we do, for example, we did a bio prelude film, a short film about how the government victimized military personnel during the 1982 attempted coup. That film has been very poorly received by what I would call government institutions. And I don't see it winning any awards, really, because it clearly talks about how till today, which is almost 30 years on, my dad is one of those officers, ex-officers, who have not got compassion for injustice. So what the government does is they muzzle you systemically. So if we submit this to an award ceremony, for example, hosted by the government, we'll be nabbed, like we have. So we don't, the government uses such sly techniques, and then you go a notch higher. They also go a notch higher in their slyness or in their unhanded techniques, and that's what we see here. And they tarnish activists' names. Like, activists here have a bad rep right now. An activist, sadly, is by the public as somebody who gets money from white people. And there's a phrase that goes around, pesa za mzungu. It's white person's Swahili, pesa za mzungu. If you're an activist in Kenya, 90% or let's say 70% of the population thinks you're getting money, foreigners, to do your activism. And this is not a coincidence. This is systemically created by the powers that be to kind of undermine the work that activists do, the work that community organizers do. So even the people at the grassroots who actually depend on these services, the people who depend on such organizing, are actually resisting it, yet they're the ones who do it. They're resisting these activists, they're resisting these community leaders, because now there's that notion that these people are being paid. They're being paid to do what they're doing, and it's not reaching the grassroots. So it's more complicated than it seems at face value. But yes, the short answer is yes, they do, and they have kind of put these barriers and subterfuge to kind of undermine the work we do, especially when it criticizes what they are doing.
Thank you, Robert. Just going to pass on to Dan just to finish this question. Dan, I mean, in terms of responses, you must have had them all. I remember reading something about you. You'd gone to a far right to protest against like the far right, wearing like a glitter jacket. And I think there was some kind of violent response, you know, and you must have experienced it all. Talk maybe through a couple of examples of responses that you've had to the work you've done.
I guess some of the responses might be, when one which is coming out very soon, we finally got the video back from the police. Again, Nigel Farage, where would I be without him? We invaded his pub 5 years ago now. This was actually one of my favorite protests, which I was lucky to be part of. We invaded his pub with lots of different groups who were affected by his bigotry and UKIP's bigotry, because we created a cabaret in the spirit of the Weimar era on the 70th anniversary of the official end of the Nazi Holocaust, to look at the parallels of the war then and fascism now. And of course, we all know that wars don't end just when governments say they do, or when they start their victory parades. They continue for generations and generations to come. And I'm sure grief of oppression, ancestral grief, is something that motivates us all. Anyway, we went into the cabaret in his pub with parodies of all the bigoted things that he was saying. You know, like, for example, he said breastfeeding mothers should face the wall. So we had breastfeeding mums with their boobs out at the bar. He blamed when it was bad weather, when gay marriage was introduced, they called it the UKIP weather scandal. And he said it was a sign from God. So we had queer people in tiny little pants dancing to It's Raining Men, the front of their pub. He blamed traffic on the M4 when he was late for a meeting on migrants. So we had like a migrant traffic jam, just like a satirical piss take of all the shit things that he was saying. And he spun it very well and said, and we saw him in the pub opposite, and we did a conga line around the pub with all the different groups, learning about each other's struggles, singing We Are Family. And he said we scared his children when we knew there were no children there at all. But he spun it very well. But we got the CCTV footage, and now, of course, we've got the evidence to show what we knew all along. There was no CCTV. There was no children there to scare. So you've got to roll with the punches, basically. You know, you've got to learn about how your enemy operates, and just try harder every time. I think just a few responses to like how we find the strength to carry on, even when you know, things might backfire initially. Then we're like, okay, we'll carry on in the spirit of praxis, the action reflection cycle that is at the heart of popular education. One book which inspires me is The Great Turning by Joanna Macy, who's an American author and activist. She kind of frames activism in three kind of pillars, and they're all reciprocal. One is obstructing bad things, so like direct actions, occupation, civil disobedience. Two is creating good things, permaculture projects, education programs. And three is general consciousness raising. But they all work in reciprocity. And we have to, you know, obviously sometimes there's a lot of ego and macho bullshit when it comes to actions of like, why are you not on the front line? Why are you not getting arrested? It's like someone might have kids, or they might not have asylum rights, so they can't do that. It's respecting and understanding the ways which people can act, and seeing it as all as a reciprocal nature, focusing on that same end game. Often I think in terms of actions, it's like stopping business as usual and publicity stunts, and sometimes one will work for one strategy and sometimes one will work for another strategy, and it's seeing how they work together. Two last points is, again, at the heart of popular education, which is the process of what we're trying to aim for when we get to conscientization, like ultimate consciousness raising, is what's called the aha moments. And Huda, what you said reminded me of that. When we really deepen our understanding and see the machinery of war, the machinery of injustice, and see how power operates, is the aha. And that's what we want to get to in ourselves and in our communities, so that we really understand and see the machinery of warfare laid naked on the table and see how we can pincer it apart. The last kind of response to how we can kind of continue to all manner of responses is not take ourselves too seriously, be able to laugh at ourselves. One meeting that I'll never forget, one activist meeting that I went to, I can't remember, a while back, and everyone didn't know, a lot of people didn't know each other, and someone said, does anyone have an icebreaker conversation, icebreaker? And I said, well, what is our biggest action fuck up? Because we all know for every good action, there's tons of them behind the scenes, which never made the papers because they were fuck ups. And someone said, oh no, I can't talk about that. I can't talk about, like, we're not going to share our screw ups. Why not? Like, that's how we learn. Like, yeah, that's how we learn. So I think it's really important to learn by doing, as we said before. And just to give an example, the horse shit action, the 1/2 ton of manure, and UKIP's action, which was a success. What happened behind the scenes, which I still giggle about, is when we were doing the recce of UKIP South London office, I got overexcited and didn't quite realise I brought the 1/2 ton of shit to the recce. And the other crew, they were like, we don't need the 1/2 ton of shit now, because we're not doing the action now. So there I was, stuck by a tube station in central London on a Sunday night with 1/2 ton of shit and had to go home. So often when you find yourself on your own in a street with no one about you with 1/2 ton of shit, don't lose hope, because you've got to laugh at yourself. So that's the one point there.
Thank you, Dan. Yeah, so okay, we're really against it with time now, so I think we've run over by quite a bit. We could probably stay and talk forever about activism, but I'm going to have to wrap this up. So I'm going to ask each one of you just very, very briefly. The idea of this session was really to kind of give people the tools and inspiration to become active and to become engaged and kind of challenge the status quo. So I'm going to ask each of you just to respond to this question. If you were to meet someone anywhere in the world who said, we can't make any change, it's impossible to make change, what would you say to them? And I'm going to start with, and again, just very briefly, we've got about 2 minutes in total. So I'm going to start with Robert.
Well, I would just tell them that you can either decide to live your life in regret or do something about it. Because my parting shot will actually be something I was once told by one of my mentors. And it's about a flat. He gave an analogy of a flat, and a flat that shares one water source at the rooftop. And he said that in that flat, one of the apartments had a leak, and the neighbor went to his fellow neighbors and asked for help, and they were aloof because they didn't have a leak in the apartment. But what they didn't know is that, or what they knew but they didn't think of, is that they share a water source. So eventually the leak caught up with them. And I feel change is so much the same. Most of the middle class in this country, most of even the rich, feel the same way these neighbors felt, that this leak does not help them, yet they share this apartment. And this apartment is Kenya, it's our country. So the person who says that needs to understand that sooner or later, they'll either live in regret or the leak will catch up with them.
Thank you, Robert. Huda.
So many ways to answer this question. I'd probably start off by saying, not of an attitude like that, you won't make any change. And second of all, I'd say that actually a lot of our problems and issues and history has shown that actually change can happen when people work together and collectively to try and drive change forward. And third of all, that a lot of our problems come from less than 1% of the global population. So that actually, if all of us came together, then the math says it all. We can make change together if we support one another and work together and drive that change forward. And fourth of all, I would say that, or D even, that I don't think we have a choice in a lot of ways. We have to keep going forward. And even if it comes to the end of my lifetime and you don't see the change, even if you're just one step closer, then the fight is all worth it. And we have to keep fighting, because otherwise our world's gone to shit. It's all going to go on fire. People continue being killed. And so we have to keep fighting.
Amazing. Thank you, Huda. Pedro?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of things that Huda and Robert said. But what I would say is that I don't think that if we look around the state of the planet that we live in, we don't really have a choice. I think it's just a matter of time for things to really start to pick up. And I guess, like, I would understand the fact that it's difficult to imagine change, but at the same time as well, it's kind of like, what do we believe as change? You know, most of the times we think that there's a silver bullet, there's one action, there's one thing, there's one objective that might actually happen, and to actually dissolve that into 1,000 million ways of actually doing this, and not just one little thing. You know, there is no silver bullet. There's just 1,000 and thousands of bullets that we just have to keep going, keep fighting, to keep pushing what we sort of believe in.
Totally. And finally, Dan?
Great question. First of all, I'd say get involved in Place of War, because then you'll get so much inspiration from like artists who use so many different methods, like very like everyday methods, like writing, which can really inspire you to like really open the floodgates for what can happen. And in that, I'd first of all say watch Still I Rise by Maya Angelou. It's like a 2-minute video on the internet, and then see if you still can't do anything. Then get a pen and paper and just one A4, write what's called freefall writing first thing in the morning. And you start every sentence with Still I Rise and finish it any way that you want. And like pay tribute to the people who have made your existence possible. Just that, you know, there'll be countless of people, numbers of people who fought tooth and nail for you to be alive today, and just write and pay tribute to 3 of them. And then that'll encourage you to see the gravity of social change on an everyday level. There's nothing more powerful than just releasing your own trauma first thing in the morning, so that you can be like, okay, I actually can do something.
Amazing. Well, I just want to say a huge thank you to Huda, Pedro, Robert, and Dan. You guys are so inspiring. And I think the thing that I've taken away from this is the world is on fire and we haven't got a choice. So it's really important for all of us, regardless of our age, regardless of where we are based in the world, regardless of our gender, etc., we all need to be engaged in helping to make positive change in the world. And I really hope that this session has given the people watching some ideas and some inspiration about ways in which they can be involved. And as Dan referenced at the beginning, a really good reference point, a really good beginning point is Beautiful Trouble, a book that's and it's available online to download, just in terms of some good strategies that you might want to kind of explore. But I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone here. It's been such an inspiration and a pleasure to have you together. And as Pedro said, let's do this again in 20 years and see what we've been doing. So thank you so much, and thank you for everybody watching.
Thank you. Thanks, Ruth. Thanks, guys.
Big love all.
Cool.